Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a professor at Oklahoma Christian University, where we're celebrating homecoming this week. Go Eagles! Woo! And I'm joined by Ken Katkin, a law professor at the University of Colorado this semester, until he returns to his home at Chase. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks, Trey. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. This is the exciting time here to be an Eagle here at OC. We have our team playing at home. It's homecoming here, and I'm really excited. All our students are excited. It's hard not to get infected with that energy.
That's great.
You're like, yeah, that's really good for you younger professors who can still. I heard all of that in there, listeners. And so now, Ken, I guess we were talking before on the air on this. Are you ready to return to your homeland of Kentucky, away from the mountainous regions of Colorado?
Well, I hope no one's listening in Kentucky, but I wish I could stay out here in Colorado a little bit longer. It's really terrific out here.
Well, I'm not going to hold it against you. I fled Kentucky now.
Yeah.
How many? We won't use the number. But no, I'm not gonna complain with you on that one. But of course, any of our Kentucky listeners, which I'm sure there's a few, are going, those two, those traitors. But we're still Americans, right? I mean,
that's
probably,
right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I know the big thing this week, listeners, and you guys have been asking about this for a long time, and we keep putting it off because it's really difficult. And if you take a look at the literature, the political science literature, if you take a look at the pragmatic polling data, it's really tough to say, here's what's going to happen with specific candidates in any election. It's a really difficult go. Now, there are some generalized trends that you can predict on. So, for example, we know, Ken, that we have a president in power who's Republican, and whether that's Donald Trump or anybody else, that means you're going to have a tough time in the midterms, right? And we know things like that. Economic conditions will help or hinder those baseline positions. But if your question is, how is Susie Q going to do in race one? That's a lot more difficult until you get real close, and even then, it's a little bit of a magic ball or it's a bad prediction.
Right.
But that's what we're going to do. We're going to give you the politics guys, Ken and Trey's bad predictions for the midterm. So here you go. Don't blame us. We've told you in advance. And I think one of the things we might want to chat about to start with, Ken, is the big picture here, and that is in the Senate. Let's start with the Senate, because we got 35 seats up for grab in the Senate. So listeners, my guess is if you're listening to the show, you probably know this, but can't hurt to go over the basics. The Constitution doesn't allow for the Senate to go up all of them for an election at one time. Instead, we do 1/3 of them every 2 years on their 6-year terms, so that you can only actually change a portion of them. The idea is they're kind of the cooling milk to the House's boiling tea. And so we've got 35 seats up. And as a matter of fact, most of those are actually in the Democratic camp, a few in the Republican camp, and the Democrats are going to need to pick up 2 seats to win control of the Senate. But that looks a little tough. So, Ken, what do you think about the Senate, Democrats' chances, or any specific race you'd like to talk about on the Senate side?
Well, I was relying on some of the main predictive websites to come up with some numbers, and so the big ones are the Cook Political Report and 538.com, I think, that do the most sort of quantitative analysis on the polling. And so I guess the last time I looked at 538, they're giving the Democrats a 81.2% chance of taking the House, and the Democrats a 14.7% chance of taking the Senate. So overwhelmingly likely that the House will switch to Democratic control, while the Senate will stay in Republican control. But of course, that's not a certainty. I mean, those longer odds on contrary results are certainly within the realm of possibility, as well. So it's even possible that it could go the opposite. If you take those numbers, that does mean there's a 3% chance that the Democrats pick up the Senate, but not the House, which is so it's not impossible. Although 3% is pretty short odds on that. So I think if the Democrats are going to have any chance in the Senate of picking it up, it runs through Texas. I don't think there's any possibility for the Democrats to take over the Senate without Beto O'Rourke beating Ted Cruz. And
What about
Cruz,
Florida, Ken? I don't mean to
oh,
interrupt you,
oh,
but
well, yeah, I mean, certainly they'd have to take Florida, but I think that would be easier. Nelson's the incumbent there. He is a little bit ahead of the polls, I think. So I'm counting the Democrats as getting Florida, and saying that
oh,
they'd still need to get Texas.
I kind of have that. I have Florida in the too close to call category myself. They've been within the margin of error
Yeah,
consistently. And I'll say, having been, a Floridian for the last some years, you shouldn't underestimate the power of Scott. In large part, and this is something that I think people outside of Florida don't really understand, while he may be hated in some ways, his responses to hurricanes were phenomenal. And if you don't think that plays huge in Florida, that's just because you haven't lived there and experienced a hurricane.
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, you could be right. I'm sure you know Florida better than I do. I was thinking that my thought that Nelson will keep Florida was based on a few factors, but they could be wrong. But I was thinking, he is the incumbent. He's got some advantages of incumbency, although I guess Scott also has some advantages of incumbency because he's been the incumbent in other statewide positions,
Right,
including
governor for two
governor. Yeah,
for two
yeah,
cycles.
yeah, yeah. And then also, I feel like you were talking earlier about the demographics and the young voters and the minority voters, and I certainly agree with you that I still would not expect young voters or minority voters to vote in the same proportions that older voters or white voters are going to vote in, but I think they will vote in higher proportions than they have before. And that's going to definitely provide an edge to Nelson. And finally, Obama has been campaigning hard down there for Nelson, and I got to think that's going to help. Obama won that state twice. I think he's still very popular there as well, and he could especially help energize some of these lower voting communities that we were just talking about.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right, but I would say that I think the key in Florida is how does the I-4 and the Miami-Dade districts turn out. I-4 is it's the interstate that cuts Florida in half, east to west, and it runs through Disneytown, also known as Orlando, and that is actually where you see most of your shifts. And as a matter of fact, that is where Hillary Clinton really failed to turn out on the ground, and where Scott has been particularly effective is in that I-4 corridor, not so much in Miami. That's kind of a foregone conclusion. The question becomes how many of those voters turn out. And you were talking about, we had a bit of a conversation right before the show started, listeners, and we were chatting, and we're going to chat a little bit more on the air about, what will turnout be for younger voters, for ethnic minorities, et cetera, because those turnout races in midterms are historically low, very, very low,
Yeah.
even lower than in presidential election years. And one of the things that it muddies this election prediction is, to what extent do you think that those kinds of groups will turn out? And I agree with you on that front, but I think it'll be that kind of I-4 corridor, at least in Florida. But you also want to talk about Texas, Ken.
Yeah, well, yeah. Let me say one more thing about young voters, because I want to agree with something you said, but maybe take a slightly different perspective on it. Young voters in midterm elections, and by young we mean under 30. I think historic rate is about 18%. That's really pathetic turnout. So to even get that up to 20, 23, 25, that's still not great turnout, but that would have a big impact. And I think that is possible.
Well, and it's interesting because the polls that we've seen thus far, when you ask people are they going to vote or not, it keeps it keeps that 18 to 29 age at a little less than a third reporting that they're going to vote. Now, you have to keep in mind that usually the reporting to vote is going to be your outside maximum, because when you ask somebody, are they going to vote? There's a lot of pressure to say, well, of course I'm going to vote, right? That's what I ought
Right.
to do. So you generally don't see that number come up higher than what we see on the reporting for the likely to vote. And so, right now we're a little under a third on that on the reporting. So, you're right. I mean, coming up, even getting to the you. Oh
A
my goodness.
quarter, I was saying. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was saying they might get up to a quarter because it's usually less than a fifth.
Yeah.
So even completely agreeing with you, I'd say there's no chance that under 30s are going to vote at more than a 25% rate. But what I'm also saying is that 25% would actually be quite a lot more than in other midterm elections, and for that demographic. So it could actually have a big impact if they get up that high. Even though by I think by your lights and mine, that's still a pretty low number, 25%.
Yeah, and I think it's something else, listeners, you got to think about is that because midterm turnout is low, it doesn't take as many percentage points in depending on how it falls into your particular race to move that needle a little bit. Whereas it would take a little bit more in a presidential race where you're talking about, national turnout. Well, I mean, again, oh my goodness, this is going to sound really high, 60% if you're lucky.
Right, right.
I think that's one of the things that's always interesting. I don't think, because if you're listening to this show, you probably are wondering how anyone doesn't vote. That's probably my assumption.
Yeah.
What do you think, Ken?
Yeah, no, I wondered that too. I mean, I know, with younger people, there's a number of reasons they don't, ranging from, they haven't developed the habit yet. So, once they've done it once, maybe they'll start doing it more, but they haven't done it once yet. And in some cases, people in that age range are very, they're moving around a lot. They're living in one place, then another place, then another place, and they don't feel, they come into a place and they don't feel like they know the local issues or the local candidates, and so they don't register to vote right away, or they move over the summer and the window of time to register to vote is closing. So there are a lot of reasons, but still, I think that the more an election gets nationalized, the more likely it is that the numbers go up at least a bit. My son made the effort to vote all the way from England, so I think other people in that range should be able to do it. His vote is in, so yeah, I think other people in his cohort should be able to maybe do it a little bit better also.
Well, maybe that's something we can talk about a little bit because that is interesting. And you point to something that the literature bears out, and that is one of the reasons that people end up voting in higher percentages is they feel connected to their community. And one of the things that we know about that 18 to 29-year-old segment is that they don't feel connected. I mean, matter of fact, if you talk with the average freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, not that I do that every day, all day. Wherever they're from, it is really unlikely for them to say, look, what I want to do is I want to get done with college and I want to live right here for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't true in Florida. That wasn't true in Kentucky. That's
Right.
not true here in Oklahoma City. I have never been anywhere where the place where I am is where they want to be. And so what happens here seems far less important to them. So why they might have a big conception of, well, I wish government was, pick your direction. The idea that I would have to care about it here is almost non-existent because they think, well, this isn't me. This isn't where I want to be. This is where my parents are. This
Yeah.
is not what I'm going to do. And there's a lot of data to back that up. That not having that place makes it much, much harder.
Yeah, I mean, I think this midterm, there's a lot of nationalization of the election. There's a lot of idea, I think, certainly from the Democratic side, that it's a referendum on Trump, and so I think that may help. That may help in terms of overcoming the idea that younger voters. I think the more they think about elections locally, the more they are not interested in voting if they're living temporarily in communities that they're not committed to staying in. But if they think about it as a nationalized election, they may want to make the effort to vote.
Yeah. Well, and we were kind of primarily here talking about the Senate, and you mentioned the House, and I'll kind of bring
Yeah.
that back in, and we can talk about young voters on that front too, if we wish.
Yeah.
But again, in the House, unlike in the Senate, all 435 seats go up every 2 years. So, right, all of our seats across the country go up in the House. And as it stands right now, if you take a look at the polling data, there's about 29 of those 435 seats that are what you'd call toss-up, meaning that polling data suggests that it could go either direction, that they're within the margin of error effectively.
Yeah.
Overall, when you take a look at the generic ballot is when we just ask people, well, how do you feel about Republicans versus Democrats? So if you had generic Republican versus generic Democrat, where do you vote? And I was a little surprised about this because the Democrats are only actually leading in that generic ballot in the House by about 6 to 8 points.
Mhm.
I had suspected earlier in the year that this number might have separated a little more, especially given kind of some of the vocal opposition to president's policies. And we're going to talk a little bit more about
Yeah.
some of the ones he floated this past week. What do you think about the House more specifically, Ken, and the generic ballot? And are there any of those 29 seats that you think we ought to talk about, like Florida and Texas for the Senate?
Yeah, I mean, it's harder for me to. I don't know as much about all 435 to talk about it on an individual basis, although I could try with a few. But
Well, we don't want to talk
yeah,
about all of them because, I mean,
yeah,
140 of them are solid Republican and
yeah,
182 of them are solid Democrat. So, by the way, if you live in one of those, good luck.
yeah.
And
One thing I would point out about the 29 toss-up districts that you mentioned, though, is the fact that there's those 29 are toss-up districts primarily is good news for the Democrats because almost all of them are currently held by Republicans, right? So if you figure that there's going to be 50-50 odds in a toss-up district that it'll be won either by a Democrat or Republican, but today, I think all but three of them are held by Republicans.
yes, you're
Then
absolutely right.
that means just based on 50-50 that the Democrats are headed to get a big pickup there in those toss-up districts.
Yeah, I mean, and that's actually a really good point because it is fascinating. They don't need to pick up that many seats. I know it seems like it's easier in the Senate when you just look at the numbers, but I think it is a little bit tougher. But you're
Yeah,
right, because who is already sitting in those seats is such a big deal. And you're right. It is 20, let's see, six of them. So, yeah, 20.
six of them are Republican now. Yep.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, so if you figure that the 29 are going to split 15-14 just based on 50-50 odds, and we don't even try to bring crystal balls there about, whether it's going to be a wave for the Democrats or not, that's already a pickup of about of 9 or 10 seats right there for the Democrats if they split it.
Now, and the other that's interesting thing as we talk about the House here, Ken, is the question of, do you think it's a foregone conclusion? Let's really put our hats on. Do you think it's a foregone conclusion that Nancy Pelosi becomes the majority leader again, or the speaker, excuse me, in the House, or do you think that she's going to finally be flanked?
No, I think I'll say this. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. I think the odds are still with her. I think if the Democrats retake the House, I'm going to say there's a 75 or 80% chance that Pelosi becomes the speaker again. Not 100% chance, but I think she's much more likely than anyone else in the Democrats to become the speaker.
Now this is a little more difficult for me because I lack a little bit of I have bias on this front.
Yeah.
Do you think, as coming from the left, do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing?
If she becomes speaker,
Yeah.
well, I think I think she was a good speaker.
Oh, okay. Because
yeah.
I know there's a lot of contention about that on the left.
Yeah, not with me. I think that to me, I would sort of bifurcate your question into two, which would be, would she be an effective speaker? Which I believe yes. The other question would be, would it be politically? Would the political disadvantages outweigh the political advantages, such that maybe if there's someone else that would be an equally effective speaker, then it would be politically more advantageous to get somebody else in there. That one I think maybe so. So that's sort of how I find that. I think there's been, yeah, as you said, some controversy within the Democrats about whether she'd be a good speaker, and there's a lot of she's been demonized a lot by the right, which has made her she's somebody that the right likes to run against, and so I think those are possible reasons for getting rid of her. But I also think I don't think anyone else is going to do the job any better than she did it from a Democratic perspective.
But do you think she can successfully go up against Trump, or do you think her pre-existing polarization makes her just the right's Trump?
Well, I think she, right. They do like to run against her, but you've got to ask in comparative perspective here. If the Democrats had a different speaker, would the Republicans just brand that different speaker as the polarizing figure and run against that different speaker? So I think how much of that is because of Pelosi herself, and how much of that is because she's been a prominent liberal Democrat for a long time that the Republicans have invested a lot of effort into turning Republicans against and making her kind of a rallying cry for Republicans. They could do that to anyone else. I mean, think about this: Bill Clinton might have been the most conservative Democrat around in his day, but the Republicans still demonized him also. So I think that it's not like there's anybody who could take a high level position in the government as a Democrat and not become painted as a polarizing figure.
Well, no, I mean, that very well might be the case, but the question becomes, does that history and baggage, because it starts off on day one, harm the ability to get something done in 2 years before you're coming around to another presidential election? Again, I have my own bias here. I think that that pre-existing baggage is problematic for Democrats to stand up to Trump, and I know that's something else we're gonna kind of talk about here in a minute, which is going to be, what happens after the midterms. Matter of fact, we're getting into that right now.
Yeah.
What happens after the midterms, and but before we kind of move on to that. Well, yeah, I mean, let's talk about one of the other things that Trump threw out there, because this is really kind of a midterm strategy, and that is the caravan.
Mm-hmm.
And let's put that in. I'm trying to put that in air quotes. It's difficult to do that over the. But we have a group of individuals. Let's put it that way, and they're coming up, and so Donald Trump has floated this idea to HBO. That he could have an executive order that would end birthright citizenship. And he even said, quote, "It was always told to me that you needed a constitutional amendment. Guess what? You don't." And when he was told that was in dispute, he says, quote, "You can definitely do it with an act of Congress, but now they're saying I can do it with just an executive order," end quote. And it's interesting because there is some big debate on this. This all kind of centers around the 14th Amendment. So listeners, for those of you who don't have your pocket constitution handy, shame on you. The 14th Amendment says, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside." And the 14th Amendment was basically a companion amendment to the 13th Amendment, which was part of the ending, the post-Civil War ending of slavery and the resultant political and legal issues that stemmed out of that. And both left and right have stepped out. The National Review had a big piece this week, kind of from the right perspective, arguing that, look, we don't want to give credence to Trump, but this is a congressional issue. It's not a constitutionally mandated issue. You're misinterpreting the Constitution. Now, Ken, I know this is a little more of your area. I mean, you're a legal professor. What's your perspective on this? And what do you think, maybe not even just about what Trump is saying here about the constitutional, the executive order, but the idea, could this be undone with an act of Congress, given that Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says that Congress gets to, quote, "establish a uniform rule of naturalization"?
Well, so I have to answer that question on two levels as well. One way to answer it would be, if you assume that we have a normal Supreme Court that would apply normal legal methodology to resolve this question, then it's 100% chance that this cannot be done by statute or by executive order. There's very few legal questions as easy as this one. But on the other hand, if you assume that we have a kind of really radicalized Supreme Court now, after the Kavanaugh appointment, that's willing to not only completely overturn, very, very well established answers to very, very well established questions, but to essentially consider that every single constitutional question is now up for grabs, and there's no such thing as a settled a question of constitutional law, then possibly Trump's right. But I don't, I don't know which situation we're in. I don't know which world we're living in. I don't know if we're living in a world where questions that have been always considered to be super easy and already decided are now up for grabs, or whether there's going to be some adherence to the text of the Constitution and to the precedents that have been decided under it. But the 14th Amendment, the Uniform Law of Naturalization stuff. Remember that it took about 60 or 70 years after those words were written before we had such a concept as an illegal alien. So at the time that the framers wrote the Uniform Law of Naturalization, there was really no concept that people could be excluded from the United States, or that people could be illegal or undocumented aliens. Aliens could just come here. The question of naturalization was whether they could become citizens, but there wasn't a concept of excludable aliens. So that we don't really get until the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which are actually post 14th Amendment. So we get the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. The 14th Amendment has the language that you read, which has a strong presumption that, I mean, not just a presumption, a statement that persons born or naturalized in the United States normally are going to be citizens of the United States. And there is just this one phrase that you mentioned that says, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And so that might sound as if there's some question about, well, what does that mean to be born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof? At the time that the framers of the 14th Amendment wrote that at the end of the Civil War, most of the evidence is that they were still thinking about excluding Native American Indians on reservations, and saying that they were in the reservations are in the United States, but not subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and so they didn't automatically get citizenship. And then the more specific question about alien parentage gets decided pretty soon after, in a case called United States versus Wong Kim Ark, which comes from 1898. So that's soon after the Chinese Exclusion Acts get enacted, which are the first acts that create this idea that we now have of undocumented aliens or illegal aliens. Chinese Exclusion Act said that not only couldn't Chinese people become citizens, but in fact they couldn't even come here. They couldn't come to the country anymore. And so the Wong Kim Ark case is about this guy who his parents were Chinese citizens who came to California. Wong Kim Ark was born here. His parents left when the Chinese Exclusion Acts got enacted, and he went to visit them and then came back. And when he came back, the customs officers did refuse him entry into the United States on the grounds that he was Chinese, and that his parents were not American. And he argued that he'd been born here, and so therefore, under the 14th Amendment, was automatically a citizen. And the court did consider whether someone who was born here to alien parents who were excludable fell within that category of subject to jurisdiction thereof. And the court said absolutely not. Anyone who's born here is a citizen. And the only expansion they made on the category of subject to the jurisdiction thereof, besides applying it to Native Indians on reservations, was to also apply it to children of diplomats, foreign diplomats. So the idea was that because diplomats have foreign immunity, they have the diplomatic immunity, that they're not subject to the jurisdiction thereof, the United States, but that other ordinary aliens, even if they are not even allowed to stay here, if their children are born here, their children are citizens. So that's been a completely well settled question since the Wong Kim Ark case in 1898. The only way that it could be answered in a contrary way is if the Supreme Court is willing to overrule a very well established 120-year-old precedent that's been continuously applied the whole time.
Well, and that's something that's interesting. That question is interesting to me as a political scientist. And, one of the things the Supreme Court, as a matter of fact, said is, we're under a constitution, but the constitution is what the judges say it is. And so that effectively means that the idea of common law and precedent, as you put it, it doesn't matter necessarily how long that there's a precedent in place. The Supreme Court can overturn that precedent. Then there's really no check on that power of judicial review. And so, this makes for an interesting political science issue, in my opinion, because you have this question of, well, is are future courts actually bound by earlier courts? And of course, the court says yes with an if and no with a but. and so you come to these kinds of pivotal moments. And so what do you think about, and this is something that I know is interesting for both listeners, and it's interesting on kind of where the legal and the political science fields overlap, that the idea that the court having this kind of power is in itself a problem because it leads to these kinds of unknowable issues.
Well, see, I don't think it necessarily has to be that way. I mean, I think that I do suspect and fear that the current Supreme Court now, with Kavanaugh having replaced Kennedy, essentially feels really unbound by these precedents, by any precedents. Which means when you ask a constitutional question, like you just asked me the question, what does the Natural Born Citizenship Clause mean? What does the 14th Amendment Section 1 mean? The idea that question could be up for grabs now actually means that literally every constitutional question could be up for grabs now, and that there's no such thing as constitutional law anymore because there's no agreed upon methodology for how you would go about answering a constitutional question.
But has there ever been an agreed upon methodology between justices? I mean, we have different kinds of textualism. I mean, you can just look at any constitutional law book and see that there has been a variety. I mean, even undergraduates have a number of different ways that judges have determined to interpret the law, from textualism 1 and 2, which is always fascinating to me, to these other variants of understanding the Constitution. So, I mean, I agree with you on what the meaning of the 14th Amendment, but I think one of the bigger interesting issues here is that this idea of what does the Constitution actually mean, it seems to, at least from my point of view, the left cares about it when they care about it, and the rest of the time they don't really care about it.
Well, I would attribute that to the right, not to the left, but I guess that's one of those things where it's just going to take me to disagree.
Well, I mean, again, the left judges will interpret the law in fascinating ways sometimes, and then they're like, but then suddenly they're interested in the meaning of the framers' take on it here. And again, I'm don't get me wrong, I'm happy about that. But my fear is that that's not what's going to actually last. What's actually going to last is this idea that what you're suggesting is always true, that the Republicans, or actually more specifically, when you have a specific judicial philosophy controlling the court, that judicial philosophy reigns until the court shifts and you have a new judicial philosophy take over.
Well, here's how I would look at that. And it's why I really only blame the right and not the left. I think that it's true that there's sincere differences about interpretive methodologies. That left and right have, maybe the right has proposed textualism as a more legitimate interpretive methodology, or originalism.
Originalism, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, whereas the left may have proposed what might be called doctrinalism, trying to extract principles from precedents and then apply those principles. So those are some sincere differences. But what I think you only see on the right, and I never see this on the left, is a really easy willingness to jettison their own stated methodologies to get a result that the Republican Party wants. And I think this case is a really typical example of it, because the text of the 14th Amendment and the original understanding of that is very clear in this case, right? I mean, how much clearer could text be than to say all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States? But yet it's the right that purports to use textualism as their primary method, that is just completely willing, I think, now to jettison that, in terms of, this is a case where textualism should clearly lead you to one result, but that textualism suddenly isn't important to the right anymore, even though that's their own methodology, when the Republicans want to reach a different result.
Well, now in the defense, that's interesting that you're pointing out for this particular one, because the justices on the court have not yet obviously ruled, because we don't have anything from Trump.
Right.
And Trump, I mean, he's about as a textualist or an originalist or anything else as he is, pick your other adjective. I mean, he's not even a conservative for that matter.
Right. No, I agree with you there.
So, yeah, exactly. And so that's kind of weird now. But we've had, even Paul Ryan has come on and said, well, no, you can't do that. So it doesn't seem exactly like there's been a uniform right position. Although, I mean, again, National Review is taking this kind of, I think, a little bit of an interesting position. But I'm not going to make the National Review the be all end all for the Conservative Party any more than I'll do that for slate on the left. Uh, so anyway, because to kind of expand on that, because I mean, you kind of seem to already be pre-assuming that the so-called conservative justices are going to rule with Trump on this one.
Yeah, well, actually, I don't really think they all will. I think there will be some who do. It's hard for me to see Roberts ruling with Trump on this one, and therefore, I actually think that the Trump, the Trump would lose this case. But I think there's I'm sure that Thomas will, and Thomas purports to be one of the textualists. I'm fairly sure that Alito will, and Alito purports to be one of the textualists, and I think there's a chance of them picking up Gorsuch as well. So it's I think Roberts, and ironically enough, I think Kavanaugh, I think are the least likely to have the more radicalized approach to a problem like this. But I just generally think that if this is not an easy question of constitutional law, then there's no longer any such thing as an easy question of constitutional law.
Well, it's interesting. I have come to the conclusion, having studied this for a while, that there are very few easy ones. But that could be my bias coming in. We always seem to. Anyway, that's a long story. We won't go into that. We don't have enough time to go. I was looking at our time, listeners, and I realized that we've got to move forward. We got one last thing we want to talk about, and that is what happens after the midterm. We've already talked about that a little bit with Pelosi. We talked a little bit about kind of this reaction of the Supreme Court. But one of the other kinds of, I'd say, minor issues, but still interesting coming up this week has been the Pelosi-Trump crosstalk on the subpoena power of Congress. And Pelosi kind of throws out, in a very light way, I would say, the idea, quote, the subpoena power is interesting, to use it or not to use it. It's a great arrow to have in your quiver. This kind of idea that she and others could use it to try to get at some things happening in the White House. And then Trump, in his usually hyperbolic, one would hope, way, but generally isn't, so we'll just say bombastic way, perhaps, calls this threat illegal, and that it's going to take years before it'll make it to the Supreme Court. Basically, that's a violation of executive power. So, assuming that, I think what we've said today is that we're kind of predicting that you take the 50-50 toss up for our House seats, and you have Democrats getting a slim majority. And then you're either going to have Pelosi as the most likely, or maybe somebody else taking over as the majority leader in the speaker the speaker in the House. And what do you think about the upcoming outcome of the midterm elections? Do you think a Speaker Pelosi and a narrow majority Democratic House will be able to investigate, change anything on the president, or do you think this becomes a sideshow? And I don't mean that in a negative way, but kind of a build up to a 2020.
Well, I do think there's going to be a lot of investigations, and in part, I think that's because I think it's going to be difficult for the parties to work together on legislation, right? So if you think about, if you've got a Democratic House, a Republican Senate, and Trump in the White House, I don't see much reason for the Democratic House to spend a lot of time working on trying to advance legislation. I think they're mainly really going to be there to check and balance against Republican legislative initiatives and stop those from going through by and large. And so that actually does leave a lot of time to do investigations. And so I think they will. I don't think there'll be an impeachment. I know people are talking about that. There seems to be no percentage in that from a Democratic perspective, since it's
there's no political win. There's no political win for that one. I mean, if you're Democrats, all you have to do is look back to the impeachment of Clinton, right, and realize that whether that would, I mean, again, let's just completely put aside the issue of whether or not, let's just assume that that's what they thought they ought to have done. There was no political points to be gained from that in the long run.
Yeah, I think that's obvious. I think you're right. And there's no other possible outcome here. If there was an impeachment trial of Trump, then no Republican senators are going to vote to remove him, and so he's going to be acquitted and arguably exonerated by the acquittal. There's no benefit in that. So I think Pelosi herself has clearly said that many times. I know a lot of Democrats are in the base are calling for impeachment. but I think Pelosi's very clear-eyed about that, and there's not going to be an impeachment. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be investigations investigating the question of whether there should be an impeachment, even if there's not going to be an impeachment in the end, because the investigations, um, I think, have political benefit to the Democrats mainly because they are going to turn up a lot of stuff, and also, I think they're justified. I think the public really deserves to know more about, all the things that Trump has been up to. Some of which may be in the news a lot, and others of which may not be in the news a lot. But I think it would be a beneficial role to have a lot of oversight investigations. I think we'll see that.
And one last thing I'd like to kind of add there, Ken, is it seems to me to be clear that Mueller has things that are coming, but obviously none of that is going to get leaked until we get after the election. And so I think we're going to have some really interesting shows in the end of November, beginning of December, because I think there's some interesting things happening there, some hints and some suggestions that the Mueller team. So I would say another thing, even maybe before we get to a Democratic-controlled House having questioning subpoena power, is going to be this issue of what's Mueller been waiting on. And I think there's something there, and I think it comes relatively quickly after the election. But I guess we'll have to wait, and you'll have to join us then.
If I could say two words about that, I think I think Roger Stone will be indicted very soon after the election. But B, I sent you an article on this. I didn't know if you had a chance to look at it, but there's some speculation that Mueller has already subpoenaed Trump.
And, yes, I had seen that, and I had seen that article before you'd sent it.
Oh yeah. So I don't know what to make of that. I mean, because the evidence for it is that it seems that from the secret grand jury proceeding, there's been a secret appeal to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, and that the appeal has gone up and down in very rapid succession a few times. Now, the names of the parties, because grand jury proceedings are always secret,
yes,
the names of the parties are redacted. We don't know who it's about, but we do know that it's been being treated on an extremely expedited basis, and also that one of the judges on the D.C. Circuit, who had worked in the Trump White House before being a Trump appointee, has recused himself from this particular proceeding, which seems to place that it would involve someone that's in the Trump White House or close to Trump, or it could be Trump himself. So I think those are the main pieces of evidence that there's definitely something going on that involves this Mueller's office and a grand jury proceeding, and a lot of wrangling that's going up and down to the appeals court, and it's being treated much more expeditiously than most of these kind of matters that go up and down to the appeals court.
And I think whatever that is, we're going to be hearing more about it once the election is over, because if it comes out sooner, I mean, Mueller he's intelligent on this front. So, but
yeah, and I guess everybody's saying Sessions is going to be fired by the end of this week, and that has some implication, I think, for the security of Mueller's position as well.
And that's an interesting question, but I think we're going to have to leave it there. And next week, maybe we'll be talking more about Sessions. Maybe we'll be talking a little bit more about the midterms. But in the meantime, I'd like to say, well, that is it for us. And I hope that you've liked what you've heard. But if you are a supporter, the show is not necessarily done for you, because right after this, Ken and I are going to be doing a bonus show for our supporters. And supporters, this week, we're going to be talking about screens, their effects on students and kids, and their political outcomes, which I think is something that has really flown kind of in a weird radar position. But if you want to know more about that, what I need you to do is to head to politicsguys.com/support, or to head to politicsguys.com and click support. By supporting the show, you will get access to the bonus show. And trust me, Ken and I are even better on the bonus show. We put our hair down. It's crazy. But be that as it may, even if you are not a supporter, you can help the show in so many ways. Subscribe to us on iTunes. Share the episodes with your friends and family. I mean, it's midterms. Give them a hard time. You know that you have a Republican or Democrat in your family who's going to love you for sending this to them. So get ready for Thanksgiving by sending them the Politics Guys. Rate us on iTunes. We love hearing from you, so please shoot us emails at mail@politicsguys.com, or, as our always fascinating Facebook conversations, on facebook.com/politicsguys page. That's right, Politics Guys page. or for the few of you who actually do this, Twitter @PoliticsGuys. The executive producers are Michael Baranowski, Jared Carson, and Trey Orndorff and Bruce Johnson. This episode was produced by Trey Orndorff. There'll be a new show this Wednesday. We hope to see you then.